Bread is life, or bread is culture. But before we start, hi, and welcome to my kitchen. As you can see, I went for a sort of a talking hands type setup with shoutouts to Techmo and Stuart Ashton and many other tech tubers whose content I have enjoyed over the years. Now, what do I mean by my opening statement? Every civilization that got its hand on grain eventually turned it into bread. It was inevitable, like gravity or taxes, and kept people alive for centuries. In Africa, we have flatbreads, unleavened, cooked, hot, fast, often on hot stones. And in South Asia, we got your naan, your chapati, your roti, mostly without yeast, but with generations worth of experience. In Europe and the Middle East, you got your sourdough, your pita, lavash, baguette. No matter the preference, we got you covered. East Asia, sure, I'm gonna admit here that it was often rice that kept people alive, but wheat and millet thrive in some places in the north. Mesoamerica, things also a little bit more complicated because what we call the old world grains like wheat were brought over by the Europeans, so not before the 1550s would they have been a thing. Instead, they were very early in using corn to make maize flour and do something we are all very familiar with, the corn tortilla. Later on, flour tortillas, of course, became quite common, and they're also what I usually make when we crave Mexican-style cuisine. And then, of course, we have the good old US of A. But let's not dwell too long on what they've done to my beloved bread. Let's just say, when your bread has that many ingredients and half of them are banned around the globe, then it doesn't really seem like bread and more like a way to save money on retirement and medical costs. But I digress. Bread, it is not just food, it's geography, it's climate, it's culture. Like the French who identify with their baguettes, we Germans identify with our baked goods. Hundreds of different types. It is ingrained, so to speak. Ingrained. Get it? Anyway, with this almost professional segue, let's talk flour. Now, this is flour and this is type 550 flour, but what does that mean? We Germans, we would be damned if we wouldn't find a way to norm anything, and by anything I sure mean anything. But how would you norm flour? It seems weird, right? Well, you do another very German thing. You take it to a lab and you burn it in a furnace under very certain conditions. And what remains is ash. And then, depending on the flour, a different amount of ash remains. So this number, it tells us how much mineral ash remains after burning 100 grams of flour. Now, we start all the way here with type 405. It is very finely milled, it is soft, it is mild, minimal bran content. It's perfect for cakes, pastries and other delicate baked goods where you want a very light and airy texture. Then you got the type 550, which is a bit more, say, robust. It has a slightly higher ash content, meaning it retains more of the wheat German bran, which makes it ideal for the classic bread and the rolls and those products where you want more structure and more chew. It's quite the workhorse, to be honest. It provides a balance between softness and strength. Then there is a type 812, which is pretty rare, I would say. I have probably used it once or twice, but I don't have it here usually, so I can't show you. And then there's 1050, which I would usually put here and which I would be able to show you, but as it turns out, I've just finished my package yesterday, and so, well, there you go. They are even darker in color, more bran, more germ. We're at this point it's becoming quite dense and full of flavor, hearty, rusty breads, rich. You could even call it an earthy flavor, but they are a little bit tougher to work with, and it's a tougher dough. in the result of it. So you would usually mix them in with other flours, right? So there's also, next up is the whole grain flour, whole grain wheat flour in this case. They don't have a number because it's a whole different kind of animal. Contains all parts of the kernel, bran, germ, everything, and so it's naturally a lot more variable in texture and also in composition, so the numbers vary too much, and we Germans don't like numbers changing too much, so it just doesn't get one. There's also the rye flour, which also gets a number, right? And this is an Italian flour, which is for visual purposes. More ash in the flour means more bran, and that's where the fiber comes from, and that fiber creates more chew, more flavor, and a denser texture. Some do consider it harder to work with, and if we ever get the series down to the really dark types of bread, you'll see why. They take on water very differently, and since they can't form the long gluten and protein strands, they are not as stable when working them on the table. You'll see that they break up more easily. But why is that? The higher the bran, the more it cuts into the gluten network, which is what gives the dough its structure. So when you increase the bran, at some point you're gonna start weakening the structure again, which sounds counterintuitive at first, but does in fact make sense. All right, now let's talk Italian real quick. We'll talk about this further down the line when and if we ever get the series up to the Italian or Mediterranean baked goods. They are categorized not by weird numbers like we do, but by the degree of refinement and coarseness of the grind. So what they usually have is tipo doppio zero, tipo 1, tipo 2 e integrale, where tipo doppio zero, type 00, is a super fine, minimal bran, minimal germ, just like sort of like the 405 in Germany. It's very soft in the hands and is often used for, let's say, more delicate doughs like pasta or some pizzas where you want a very smooth and airy texture. So if you ever made pizza dough with tipo doppio zero, you'll find it quite similar to working with the 405. Now tipo zero is a little bit coarser, retains more of the bran, and it's most commonly used for other pizzas where you want more of a balance between softness and structure. Now tipo 1 and tipo 2, type 1 and type 2, are more coarse, higher ash content, higher extraction rate, and they are more for the rustic types of baked goods that they have over there, with a richer and more complex flavor. And they of course also have their integrale, their whole grain variants. So when you're making pizza in the US and you only find German flour for whatever reason, probably grab the 550 or grab 405 550 and then mix them a little bit to get sort of a middle ground situation between everything. Also, and I don't know if you have these here in Europe and Germany, they are, or all products are required to have a certain label telling you how much fat, how much sugar, how much carbs, and how much proteins is in everything. If you have these, check that you can find flour that has at least 10 grams of protein per 100, more is better. Why? You see, when flour first comes into contact with water, then inside the long gluten and protein strands form, but they are chaotic, they are unordered and unorganized, and that's not a German type of deal. So that is why when you see people handling dough, they will often stretch it and fold it and stretch it and fold it. And what happens when you do that? You put these strands in order, long strands, ordered, folded over each other, forming what we Germans call a Gitternetz, or a grid mesh, for lack of a better word. And if you do that often enough, you create a very orderly structure within your dough. But here it is of course important to consider that not everything that you bake should have this nice, dense, orderly structure. You definitely want it in a bread, in a classic German bread, but other things like a baguette or a Brötchen, you do not want it. Why? When you break those open, you want them to be light, to be airy with the big gas bubbles, crunchy on the outside. They need to feel light, almost weightless. And if you overwork the dough on these, then they will become too heavy. And I want to talk a little bit about something called yeast. And yeast is ancient. The Egyptians likely discovered sourdough by accident, with wild yeasts in the air and the grain on the hands, spilling water, warm climate, and one can easily see how it would come to pass. And for centuries remained a mystery, and people were unsure why and how it happened until Louis Pasteur finally realized that yeast is in fact a living organism responsible for fermentation. And this is commercial yeast, one pure single strain of highly effective yeast designed for fast, reliable rising of your dough, but in my personal opinion with multiple downsides. And this is sourdough, often years old, like this one is about 4 years old. It used to be a staple of households throughout Central Europe, often passed down through generations, and it is a wild mix of different wild yeasts and other bacteria producing a much more complex flavor, but also creates slower results. So bread is life, and in this series we'll try to show you how to make it and make it properly. See you next time.